Welcome to Save Me From My Shelf, a literature podcast where we take classic tomes off their pedestal to make you less anxious about reading them. Our jokes come from a place of love and for a specific teaching purpose. However, if you think that making fun of great literature, and maybe some mild swearing, is offensive, this might not be the podcast for you.
Hello, welcome to Save Me From My Shelf, the third edition.
Third episode, even.
Indeed.
I'm Abby, by the way, for our new listeners.
Oh yeah, and I'm Daniel.
And yeah, we do have some new listeners. We've released our first couple of episodes, so welcome if you are new to this show. Yeah, how are you feeling about now being an internet sensation? Has it gone to your head yet?
Kind of tired of getting chased around train stations and things, but apart from that, it's fine. What about you?
Well, you have a bunch of handlers now, and they told me, do not make eye contact with Dr. Jenkins Smith. He cannot pod under these conditions. So
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Of the two of us, we know who's going to be the diva.
They were wrangling me and things,
yeah. Yeah, your entourage.
Yeah. Administering sedatives. And I believe we've had a first official book recommendation.
Yes, the first write-in book recommendation from our institution's librarian. Rich, our librarian, suggested, I think he's a kindred spirit who listened to our first episode and liked your idea of a book with no plot but with twists. So he has suggested that we read Berg by Anne Quinn. I have no idea what this book is.
I have a hopelessly mainstream taste in literature, I think. So yeah, this looks a bit arty, doesn't it? But yeah, maybe that'll be a good shout for the next series.
So what is our text today?
It is a little-known work inspired by a Kate Bush pop song called Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë.
So I will do the typical warnings, so we're going to spoil this, obviously, when we recap it. The trigger warnings for this is a very violent book. It's a very emotionally and physically abusive book. There's definitely a bit of sex stuff we're going to talk about, possibly some racism, probably a little bit of incesty stuff, a little bit of necrophilia stuff, as I said at the end of our last episode. So just, you've been warned.
All the greats.
All the heavy hitters, yeah. Do you want to give a little background on the Brontës? Because, boy, they're almost more interesting than the books they wrote.
Yeah.
What a weird family.
Was the vicarage they lived in all kind of run down and, I think... Am I right in thinking the water supply was polluted by the graveyard and things like that? I think it was a very sort of down-at-heel lifestyle. 4 siblings, when they were younger, they wrote those fantasy things, didn't they? Those sort of Game of Thrones type kind of things. I think they were quite a weird bunch of people. Anyway,
they were incredibly weird. So they were very deeply isolated. Emily Brontë, who is I believe the youngest sister, and certainly the weirdest of all of them, for sure. She almost never left their parsonage.
I think Anne's the youngest.
Oh, is Anne the youngest?
I've been to Anne Bronte's grave in Scarborough, so I'm pretty much an expert.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes, of course. Yes. Okay, well, Emily was one of the younger ones anyway. And
they were the younger two, yeah. Sorry. In a weird family, she was one of the weirdest, I think.
God, yeah. So, I mean, they really just sort of let the kids kind of run around and do whatever they wanted. Just real precocious Montessori crap. These were some very free-range children. But Emily Brontë, there's a story that I think just encapsulates her so well. Because these sisters were all sort of dark and twisted and gothic and romantic in their own ways, but Emily Brontë once was walking out on the moors and some rabid dogs attacked her, and she managed to drag herself back, and she cauterized her own wound with a red-hot poker. She's a living Marlborough Light.
Yeah. Wasn't she really tiny as well?
I think they all were, because I know that Charlotte Brontë, I believe, was 4'9", so she's the same size as an emperor penguin.
Oh, I thought one was really tall and one was really short.
Oh, that's interesting.
I think Anne was just kind of normal in that Anne way.
In that Anne way.
Yeah, good old Anne.
Okay, let's start a rumor here that Emily Brontë was 6'6".
Yeah.
Charlotte Brontë was 4'9".
Yeah.
And they were all creeps. So in 1847, all of the Brontë sisters published a great work of literature under a pseudonym. So the names they picked because they didn't want to necessarily be considered lady novelists. They wanted the work to stand more on its own merit. So they adopted sort of unisex names. And their names were Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. And so Charlotte, who was writing as Currer, published Jane Eyre. Anne, writing under the name Acton, published Agnes Grey, and Emily, this year, writing under the name Ellis, wrote Wuthering Heights. And so Agnes Grey and Jane Eyre were really, really celebrated, but Wuthering Heights, I think people found it very disturbing. So it was deemed by one critic to be, quote, the nightmare of a recluse.
Yeah, West Yorkshire. That's, I'm just thinking that the only other thing they've got is Last of the Summer Wine. I think Bramwell might have, I think the point of overlap is that Bramwell probably rode down Haworth Hill in a bath.
Almost, one of them did, at the very least.
Ideally, we want all the Brontes run down Haworth Hill in a bath.
This is a niche, I think, quite British, 70s or 80s TV show, for those of you who don't know.
It's got Peter Sallis in it, Mr. Bonteen from The Pallisers, also played Wallace, lesser known role from Wallace and Gromit. So, it has got big names.
I like that you go with, again, the most niche. Like, clearly he was Mr. Bonteen in this niche 70s BBC production.
Get out there and watch that. That's what I'm here. I'm here to promote the Pallisers, really.
Okay, all right. I like that a little bit before you were saying how, what was it, how basic bitch your reading tastes were, and now here you're just digging up everything from the BBC archive. Should we start?
Yeah, let's begin the book.
Okay. So, the book opens on this guy named Lockwood, who has moved to the ass end of Yorkshire to this house called Thrushcross Grange. I'm never going to say that correctly.
Thrushcross.
Thrushcross.
I kept writing Thrushcroft when I was,
They picked a name that cannot be pronounced, which I wonder if that might be slightly the point. But just know that if I start slurring Thrushcross Grange, over the course of this podcast, it's because it's difficult to pronounce word on purpose, and also maybe my ketamine just kicked in. That's a joke.
Names are going to be a recurrent
Names are a big
issue.
thing, right.
I'm just going to warn you right now that I'm going to confuse a lot of characters' names.
That's fine.
Definitely keep all of this in. We're going to have you can do a little ding every time we get a name wrong.
So, Lockwood moves into this house that is being rented out by a guy named Heathcliff, who lives about 4 miles down the road in this other big mansion that he owns called Wuthering Heights. And Lockwood has made the fatal mistake of really liking Heathcliff and deciding, I want us to be best friends. So he sort of thinks chirpily that he and Mr. Heathcliff have so much in common because they both love solitude. And Lockwood just sort of annoys me from the beginning because he's sort of the guy who would corner somebody at a party who clearly does not want to talk to him and insist that you reveal your, Myers-Briggs personality type. And he's like, I'm an INFJ too. Yeah. And it's like, well, why are you talking to me then? So he won't leave Heathcliff alone. He's really annoying. Heathcliff is super rude to him at every turn. Whenever Lockwood just turns up out of the blue at Wuthering Heights and is like, hi, buddy. He's completely inhospitable. The house is this gothic, run-down mansion. It has all these, feral dogs growling at people in it. That's a great bit, yeah. It's really funny. He's like, Nasher, get back, Yeah. And Heathcliff even goes so far as to insinuate that the house is goddamn haunted, right? And Lockwood just sort of derps his way through the situation. So he's another himbo. No, I'm gonna find a himbo in every episode of this podcast. It's my right. It's my right as an American.
Yeah, the 40th Amendment. Yeah.
So during one of Lockwood's many visits to Wuthering Heights, where he is clearly unwelcome, he gets stuck there in this sudden blizzard. And so while he's there, he meets these two other people, this sort of lumpish boy named Hareton Earnshaw, and he's not really sure what this boy's relationship to Heathcliff is. Lockwood calls him the clown at my elbow, and he doesn't know if he's a relative or a servant or what. And then he also meets this really vicious young girl who has been married to Heathcliff's son before he died. So she's, Heathcliff's widowed daughter-in-law, right? And her name is Kathy. And one of the things that this book gets picked up on a lot by the casual reader is that it's hard to follow sometimes because there are two Kathys in this book, their mother and daughter. So this is the younger daughter, and she's not actually the main Kathy, so don't worry about her too much. I'll try to differentiate between them.
Hey, she's just as main a Kathy as any other Kathy.
Oh, sorry, yeah, you prefer the younger generation.
I support the second half of the book.
I
endorse this second half.
I don't not support it, but she's not the Kathy people think of. So Lockwood sees these horrible young people. He's kind of weirded out. A servant then says, okay, I do actually have a bedroom we can put you in, but Heathcliff won't let anyone near it, so you need to sort of stay mum about this. This is supposed to be sort of private. So here you are, here's your bed sheets and your towels. Also, there's a ghastly secret about this room. Good night. And so he does some snooping. He finds this old diary and sees that a woman from 25 years ago named Kathy, the older Kathy, the mother of the two, used to live there. And so he falls asleep reading her sort of creepy diary, and he wakes up to see a fucking ghost. So he screams. He screams for 9 days straight, and he wakes the whole house up. And Heathcliff is furious that Lockwood has had access to this room, but he's more furious, weirdly, that Lockwood got to actually see Cathy's ghost. So apparently, she reveals herself to everyone except Heathcliff. And at this point in the story, we don't really know what Heathcliff did to her in life, but I love that she is literally ghosting him in the afterlife.
Yes, yeah. Had a bad night, Lockwood, hasn't he? He returns to Thrushcross Grange in the snow and is ill and kind of hangs around in bed. Bedridden is the term, I believe. His servant, Nellie Dean, kind of hangs around in that way that servants do, and she reveals that she's actually quite intimately connected with Heathcliff and the rest of the gang, and sort of lays out some context for what Lockwood had just seen. So first of all, she explains that Wuthering Heights was the ancestral home of the Earnshaw family, and that Thrushcross Grange was that of the Lintons, and these are the two big families that kind of dominate the novel.
They're the only families in the area. This is such an incestuous little book.
It's like somebody got 2 decks of cards and they're just shuffling them back and forth.
Constant. Yeah. I think that's a really good metaphor for this book, because there are so many characters that sort of marry in and move out and move,
and swap names and things. What's the just briefly also? I mean, how rich are these people? Because I was imagining they're sort of on the arse end of the gentry. Like,
yes,
they don't have titles or anything, do they? They're landowners, but the houses are fairly like. I imagine it like a sort of. You know when you go to one of those sort of country pubs and there's all like brass on the walls and it's like a big place, but it's still it's ultimately a bit crap.
Yeah.
I imagine them being a bit like that. It is revealed that Lockwood stuff is a frame narrative because Nellie Dean starts to tell him the whole story of what's going on with the two households. And
yeah, because she was a servant in both of these households because they were so intermarried. She was sort of passed back and forth as the housekeeper. So there are... Back in, sort of the day, the time that she's talking about, there were 2 Earnshaw children in one household, and one is Cathy, who will become the mother, Cathy, and her brother, Hindley. And then in the house that Lockwood is renting, every time.
Thrushcross.
I'm never going to get it. Never once.
It is hard, isn't it?
I hate it. I hate its guts. But there were 2 children there who were a little bit sort of like weedy milksops.
They're slightly... prettier.
They're slightly prettier. Yeah. Edgar and Isabella. Yeah. Okay, so that's the setup we need. 2 families, 2 kids each. And now we're back in time. Yeah. Right?
Back to the 1760s.
That's the cast. So one day over at Wuthering Heights, back in the day, Nellie Dean tells us, Mr. Earnshaw, the patriarch, and Hindley and Cathy's dad, is like, hey kids, I'm going on a business trip. And when he comes home, he's like, oh, I brought you guys a present. And what he brought them back, he opens up his big coat, and inside is, quote, a dirty, ragged, black-haired child. Just like, oh, a feral child of my very own.
Well, they all ask for nice things, don't they, from Liverpool? Yeah. They're all like, oh, can I have a violin? And he's like, didn't get you a violin.
Instead, I got you a little twerp brother that you're going to hate. And they're like, oh, Daddy, hooray,
There is Heathcliff. We found him.
Yeah, he found this, like, waifish child on the road or whatever, and there's a lot of racial ambiguity about Heathcliff. So over the course of the book they call him a gypsy several times. There's one bit where they're not sure if he's of Indian descent
or Chinese as well.
Chinese descent. And he's like, well, what should we name him? Let's name him Heathcliff. That'll be both his first and last name, like Moses or Cher. So Heathcliff and Cathy become friends pretty quickly. They're sort of brother and sister, sort of playmates, sort of childhood sweethearts. So again, it's very ambiguous and incesty. But Hindley, the older brother, absolutely loathes Heathcliff. He just hates his guts from day one and abuses him really badly. And Heathcliff, in fairness, can give as good as he gets. But Nellie Dean says, and we're not really sure how true this is because she's seen a lot of stuff subsequently since they were all kids. So I'm not sure how accurate this is, but she tells Lockwood that from the very beginning, Heathcliff bred bad feeling in the house. So, he's sort of like if the entire cast of Lord of the Flies was sort of stuffed into one human suit. So she seems
It's good parenting in it, just... Throw some, like, cat among the pigeons and see what happens, I think.
The dad needs to buy everyone here therapy under the, like, you break it, you bought it rules.
Yeah. Earnshaw dies, and Hindley has been at university, and he comes back, and he's married to a woman called Frances. And he's a bit like a Leopold in The Simpsons, isn't he? He kind of turns up at Wuthering Heights and goes, things are going to be very, very different around here. And starts to kind of... bully Heathcliff even more, and he says that Heathcliff is no longer one of the family, he's going to be a sort of servant / feral boy.
Yeah, he makes him a manual laborer and just the most degrading tasks.
He refuses to let him, like, talk to the curate and stuff, doesn't he? Like, there's an idea that his spiritual development is being stymied as well. He's ostracised, isn't he? He's brutalised and ostracised. Despite this, Catherine and Heathcliff remain close, and they're out there on the wily, windy moors, rolling around in green. Although
the little vagabond children.
Yes, and then during one of their sorties on the moors, they kind of come across Thrushcross Grange and have a little kind of game where they're eavesdropping on the Lintons. And they're all kind of in the house, aren't they? Going, "Father, may I have another glass of milk?" And things like that. And the kind of Heathcliff and Cathy are kind of laughing, and
they're like, "What nerds?"
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And somebody says, like, "Who just said what nerds?" And the Linton parents release the hounds. It's a very Simpsons heavy bit. This, isn't it? It's funny that. And Skulker, one of the dogs.
That is the greatest name for a dog.
It's a good name. Yeah. Presumably he skulks. "Smithers, what happened to Crippler?" I need to stop. Skulker bites Catherine, and so whereas Heathcliff gets sent home, with a flea in his ear, Catherine is laid up Shea Linton's at Thrushcross Grange.
They were like, "That can't be Cathy, the little heiress of the house. She looks like a dirtbag."
Yeah.
But then they recognize her, and so they take her into the home. So Cathy stays there for 5 weeks until her leg is healed up, and in that time, because she sort of is able to get away from the roiling circus of horrors that is Wuthering Heights, she actually is able to learn better manners and kindness, and she comes back a little bit more prussified as well.
A lady.
She comes back a lady, essentially. Yeah. And Hindley's wife, Frances, seeing how much Cathy has improved, is like, "Right, I've got this great idea. Let's keep her down this ladylike path. I'm going to buy her fine clothes. I'm going to make her vain about her appearance, and then she'll stop running all around with Heathcliff," right? All this really succeeds in doing is teaching Cathy that she now has another metric by which she can manipulate people and be horrible. She's like, "Oh, I'm actually kind of a babe. I can use this to my advantage." So Heathcliff, meanwhile, is grubbing around in the dirt and only having sort of weekly baths. I think Nellie Dean says she has to force him to take a bath every week, so average teenage boy, I think. Well, Heathcliff gets mad at Cathy for finally being introduced to soap, and this heightens a sort of sexual and class tension between them. And this is around the time that Heathcliff he vows to basically start choreographing this slow ballet of bullshit to make himself worthy of Cathy. And so he sees that Edgar Linton, the little boy from teenager by this point, from the other house, has started showing interest in Cathy, starts courting her, right? And Heathcliff does not like this. So he starts dandying himself up. And obviously he's still deeply poor, he doesn't have access to nice stuff, so little prissy Edgar Linton thinks it's hilarious that Heathcliff,
This is a good bit, isn't it?
You love this bit.
The awful Christmas dinner.
You are champing at the bit. You're like, "Say it faster." So Edgar Linton, he makes fun of Heathcliff attempting to be a little bit foppish.
Attempting the coxcomb.
Yes, attempting the coxcomb. So Heathcliff smashes a bowl of hot applesauce in Edgar Linton's
A tureen, please.
Oh
I
my
want
God.
the proper crockery represented here.
Would you like to say it? Would you like to retell it? I know you guys need to know that Daniel's eyes lit up at this scene. Just anything weird usage of food you find fascinating.
It's really like, just why the tureen of hot applesauce? I don't know if you're familiar with metaphor, but I think it's like the sort of forbidden fruit or something.
Oh, do you think?
Yeah,
that's a good reading.
Maybe,
yeah, I think so.
Yeah. It's just a good bit anyway, because I just feel really sorry for Heathcliff, isn't it? Because he's got his they're all like, "Oh, look at you with your posh hair, trying to do your nice hair. You look like crap, mate." And
it's the finest of ripping finery.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And then he just kind of whacks the guy, which is a good bit.
I'm sorry, I should have let you tell. Yeah.
It should be gravy, shouldn't it? I think, or I don't know if.
There's something much more degrading about applesauce. I don't know why.
Yeah.
I could not tell you.
No, I'm prepared to accept that. So, Hindley and Frances have a son, Hareton.
Too many H names in this book. I'm just going to say it right now.
And too many tons as well. Yeah. Hindley and Frances have a son, Hareton. Frances dies thereafter of consumption, unfortunately. So, Hindley is naturally quite upset about this and has a kind of breakdown and becomes an alcoholic.
I mean, a real, career alcoholic.
Yeah.
I was kind of thinking, from the way everyone else behaves in this book as well, I think they're all on the sauce a little bit, too. Like, these teens just have...
And not applesauce.
Not applesauce.
Am I right? Yeah.
That's cute. No, they all have malt liquor in their cereal. I mean, come on, for people to act like this. They're hanging out with Mickey Rourke. No offense to Mickey Rourke.
Well, yeah, because there's even that bit where he's kind of holding baby Hareton and drops him down the stairwell, and Heathcliff manages to kind of leap in and save Hareton. So that's, Edgar's kind of pretty much signed out.
Not a great, you mean Hindley?
Hindley's pretty much signed out. There you go. Number 1. I feel like we need to keep a running total of name f***ups. So, in the meantime, Catherine starts to kind of drift away from Heathcliff and closer to Edgar Linton, as Heathcliff feared. And Heathcliff becomes even more brutish and twisted. And I love this bit about Heathcliff's deterioration. Personal appearance sympathised with mental deterioration. He acquired a slouching gait, an ignoble look. His naturally reserved disposition was exaggerated into an almost idiotic excess of unsociable moroseness, and he took a grim pleasure, apparently, in exciting the aversion rather than the esteem of his few acquaintances. Catherine announces that she and Edgar are going to get married, but then she adds that this is mainly in the name of respectability and money, and that she nevertheless feels a very profound connection to Heathcliff, and that she is kind of marrying Edgar so that she could even get Heathcliff out of his kind of awful current state, doesn't she? But there's this is one of the key bits in the novel, isn't it? Because there's that funny semicolon where she, it would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now, so he shall never know how I love him. Semicolon. Turns out Heathcliff was listening up to that point, doesn't know it's a semicolon, thinks it's a full stop, how can you tell when people are talking, and kind of runs out in a rage. Then she carries on and does this whole "my love for Heathcliff is the eternal rocks" bit, where we see that actually she does have this profound connection to him.
Yeah, this is one of the most famous passages in the book. And so this book is often touted as a romance, and then a lot of people tend to push back on that because everyone here is so awful and it's just so hate-filled that people are like, no, it's really twisted that anyone could read this book and think it's a romance. But I think this passage is part of the reason why people do cite it as a sort of big love story. I am not going to come down too hard one way or the other, but this passage, to me, does tell me that everyone, no matter how horrible, deserves just a bonkers boyfriend that you would burn down the world for.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good bit. But the semicolon device is slightly silly, isn't it?
Isn't Heathcliff hiding behind a couch to escape one of Hindley's alcoholic rages? And that's when Kathy comes in and is like, Nellie, let's do girl talk now.
Yes, yeah.
So Heathcliff runs away thinking, oh no, Kathy's engaged to this other guy. He doesn't hear how much she actually really loves him, the fact that she's largely marrying Linton because he's young, hot, rich, and convenient, but also she can use his money to improve Heathcliff's life so he doesn't have to always be under Hindley's drunken thumb. So after a while, Heathcliff comes back, and he's been away earning his fortune to make himself more socially acceptable to marry Kathy, only he's too late. So Kathy's already married. He keeps going over there to sort of flirt with his ex-girlfriend sister, and while he's there, Isabella Linton, Edgar's younger sister, starts sidling up to this handsome, rich Heathcliff, batting her eyes and being like, did somebody say horrible sex? Because that's what we'd have. And so she starts getting really jealous because Heathcliff and Kathy spend way too much time together. And she confesses to Kathy that she's actually in love with Heathcliff.
A fantastic preference, it's called, isn't it?
A fantastic preference. That is actually a very charming way of wording something. But Kathy's like, listen, dummy. He will marry you for your money and then loathe you after. This guy is a sentient pair of knuckle dusters. Only I am strong enough to deal with him and wrangle him. Don't do it.
The guy's no good.
Yeah.
No matter how straight he can stand up now. That's the big thing, is that when he comes back, they're like, wow, this guy can stand up straight.
Yeah, there's the implication that he had been in the army, but this doesn't really make a ton of sense because in the old days, if you wanted to succeed in the army,
you had to be rich anyway.
You had to be really rich anyway, and your parents would basically, or your family would buy you a commission in the army, so they would pay the army to take you. It's a bit of a mystery what happens. We never know for sure. They say, oh, his posture has changed, he walks like an officer, even though that almost definitely cannot be the case given his financial circumstances. But then he also has a ton of money, and they're like, well, where did it come from?
Yeah.
We don't know. We never find out.
It's a silly bit, isn't it? Yeah.
So Heathcliff is talking to Kathy, and she's like, hey, can you believe that, dumbass Isabella likes you and whatever? And he's like, actually, maybe let's contemplate marrying her for a bit. And then he says, and this is so distressing, he says to Kathy, you'd hear of odd things if I lived alone with that mawkish, waxen face. The most ordinary would be painting on its white the colors of the rainbow and turning the blue eyes black every day or two. They detestably resemble Linton's. And Kathy responds with, delectably. What an unhinged couple. He's basically like, yeah, maybe I'll marry her. I'll beat the crap out of her. And Kathy's like, ooh, yeah. What the hell is
They're
this?
not very nice, are they?
This
So
is
at the very least.
So Heathcliff is currently having the time of his short and horrible life, just being a trifler and an all-around wrong-un. And he starts slowly winning money from Hindley. He keeps going back over to Wuthering Heights and he's like, hey, you're kind of my older brother who hates me. You're drunk all the time. Let's play cards. And he slowly just takes over the house as Hindley becomes more and more financially indebted to Heathcliff. Heathcliff all of a sudden is just like, and this house is mine now, I guess.
Yeah.
So Heathcliff is able now to get childhood revenge on Hindley for making him basically a servant by then making Hindley's son Hareton this horrible manual laborer, and he denies him the ability to sort of learn to read, and he just really degrades him as much as possible. So he almost can't speak, like, well into his early childhood because he's raised so sort of abusively.
Yeah, it's really sad.
It's really grim.
It's two wrongs don't make a right. I think that's what we're all learning here.
Oh, I took the opposite message. I thought we're not supposed to do this. So it's really awful. So he's doing that. He's going over to Thrushcross Grange.
Thrushcross.
Every time. And he's flirting with Kathy. He's flirting with Isabella. And so all of this makes just everyone furious at Heathcliff. And so they're all about to get into a huge fight over it, and Heathcliff is ready to sort of physically assault Edgar Linton, and he says, I'll crush his ribs like a rotten hazelnut. That's revolting. But Edgar Linton is so weak and so mealy-mouthed about it that they ultimately call off the fight. And Heathcliff screams that he can't believe that Kathy chose this guy over him. He's like, this consumptive milksop, I wish you terrible sex forever. And she's like, yeah, well, if you marry Isabella, I wish you terrible sex forever. And to be honest, that's
direct quote, yeah.
Look, it's not a direct quotation, but
it's the spirit of the book.
I am channeling Emily Bronte. I am merely a vessel.
Okay.
So Heathcliff storms off in a rage, and Kathy goes full dramatic 12-year-old and takes to her bed. And she laments that she's dying, and she threatens, I love this, but she threatens to starve herself to death, except when she gets hungry, and then she eats something. And she's like, but next time, I swear to God, I'm going to starve myself. So, while Kathy's having her giant strop, Heathcliff finally convinces Isabella to run away with him. They elope. And this is kind of his revenge on Kathy for marrying Linton. It's a revenge on Linton for being Linton, and he just does a sick ollie over Edgar and Kathy's heads and is like, suck it, losers. And
topical reference there with the skateboarding.
Thanks. I like to keep my finger on the pulse.
Cool.
They run off and get married, and Isabella almost immediately sends a letter back to Thrushcross Grange. Hooray, I did it!
No, you did. You said Thrushcross.
Isabella soon thereafter sends Nellie a letter. So she writes a letter back home saying, I've made a horrible mistake. I mean, immediately, within minutes of them leaving the church, because Heathcliff he does a complete 180, starts treating her really terribly, and she writes back home that Heathcliff is either, quote, a devil or a madman. And so he basically locks her away in Wuthering Heights. I don't know if you wanted to talk here a little bit about the Byronic hero, because Heathcliff has this little thing where he talks about how he abused this sort of common literary trope to win her over. What does that phrase mean, Byronic hero?
A sort of character, usually in a poem by Lord Byron, that is kind of brooding and troubled and handsome and has a quiff and kind of has stuff going on in his life, but you don't know what it is, and he's kind of this sort of lonely, sort of exotic figure. It's almost so entrenched in the culture that we don't even need a term for it, but that sort of, like a sort of rock star type, but 200 years ago. Yeah,
so it was, Byron sort of worked this a little bit from the idea of the romantic hero, capital R romantic, of, I have a lot of emotions and I'm passionate and I don't fit with polite society quite. Yeah. And Byron sort of turned it more into this, I think the phrase that is often used is the fallen angel trope.
Yeah.
But then
you're going to stand on the edge of a cliff with your arms crossed, kind of your head down. That's what you do, don't you, if you're a Byronic hero? And kind of go, don't bother me. I'm thinking on things. I'm
thinking my deep thoughts, and girls are like, yes, you are.
Exactly, yes.
But, I mean, Heathcliff is taking the piss, and he says that he sort of plays up being this sort of romantic, almost Byronic figure, but he perverts that so deeply here. So he says about Isabella, she abandoned them, her family, under a delusion, picturing me a hero of romance and expecting unlimited indulgence from my chivalrous devotion. So he was clearly playing this up to try to win her over. So there are multiple climaxes in the book, but I think this is really the big one, the big scene here, even though it's sort of halfway through. So, despite this huge rift between their families where everyone hates Heathcliff, he manages to sneak back into Thrushcross Grange, to see Cathy. And despite him having just married somebody else, Nellie Dean lets him in, and Nellie Dean, remember, is telling this story, so she's presumably in the room with them. And he and Cathy just go to absolute town, macking on each other. It is just French kiss city up in here. And it's all very tortured and violent. It's not particularly sexy, because they sort of paw at each other like sexual pumas, and Nellie Dean's just like sitting in the corner with popcorn, just sort of being like, yeah, get it. So they are real handsy with each other, and then Edgar Linton walks in on them. Obviously, he's not very happy. Cathy falls down into some sort of faint, and then we discover, to our shock this whole time, that she is heavily pregnant, because they say a few hours later she gives birth to a little girl, who they also name Cathy, who's the girl we met at the beginning. But then Cathy dies in childbirth.
Right, so during Catherine's sort of death throes, Heathcliff has this kind of vigil outside Thrushcross Grange, doesn't he? And there's that funny bit. I love this bit where Nellie goes out to see him. They can all see him there standing by this tree, kind of bothering them. And Nellie goes to see him, and she sees that he doesn't look well, Heathcliff to say the least. And she sees all like kind of specks of blood on the branches, on the trunk of the tree. So she kind of surmises that Heathcliff has been repeatedly smashing his face into the tree trunk. Then he later returns to the Heights, and I'm annoyed because you didn't mention the special gun in the bit about Isabella's letter. Isabella mentions in a letter to Nell.
I was going to let you cover it, friend.
Well, it's fine. I just love the special gun.
Don't tell me how to do my job. No, I was leaving it for you.
Okay. It's very good of you. It's very good of you. Heathcliff returns to the Heights, and we've already been informed in the letter from Isabella that Hindley has a special gun with a knife on it. She's kind of like, what a weird special gun that is. And
that he keeps with him, because you want a drunk to have access to it.
This is my special gun. That's what Hindley says, isn't it, at that point?
Well, Hindley asks her, he's like, listen, I see how Heathcliff treats you. You see how Heathcliff treats me. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. You and I need to partner up and kill him. Basically, you just have to not do anything. I just want to let you know, I'm going to kill him today. Yeah. Just don't say anything.
And then...
And then she goes and she tattles to Heathcliff.
Yeah, it could have been over so easily, couldn't it? And a much shorter book as well, which is kind of the dream.
You're assuming Hindley would be able to hit anything in this state.
It's a special gun. Who knows what it can do? Anyway, so Heathcliff finds out. He does this whole kind of like... mad green beret thing where he jumps in through the window and starts grabs the gun out of Hindley's hand and kind of batters Hindley, and it's a pretty intense bit.
I'm surprised they never had a sort of Arnold Schwarzenegger version of this film, because you feel like that scene was lifted straight from an 80s film.
Oh yeah, or maybe like a western as well. It seems like a big bar brawl. Or
yeah. It's a very action heavy scene anyway, when you're not really expecting one.
Yeah, I was like, what?
Yeah, Isabella tries to help him because Hindley gets his ass handed to him in this bit. Heathcliff's like, kill me, will you? So he beats him up, and when Isabella tries to help him, Heathcliff throws a knife at her. Just this book is bonkers.
Yeah, no,
I'm sorry.
Crazy. It's a crazy bit. Yeah.
But in that sort of bit, he throws the knife at her, and she's like, "Okay, I finally had enough," and she's able to escape.
Yeah, she bolts. That's what the next thing is, isn't it? That Isabella is already pregnant as well with Heathcliff's child. She leaves Wuthering Heights and goes down south and gives birth to a Heathcliff's son, Linton.
Just to make it extra confusing, she now has a little boy named Linton.
Linton Heathcliff now. Yeah, that is...
This is why people hate this. I didn't find it difficult to follow at all, the names. I can't say them, but I have no problem tracking who's who. But you can see you're like, wait, how many Lintons are there? How many Cathys are there? There's Heathcliff, Hareton, Hindley. It does your head in a little bit.
I did get confused, but I kind of thought that was the point. Yeah, it's about all trauma revisiting itself on the next generation.
Yes, exactly.
That's what the names are for, aren't they?
Well, and that's why they have a family tree at the beginning. So just flip back and be like, wait, who is this again?
Well thumbed in my version.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. We kind of cut back to Lockwood, and he's like, "Lorks, what a wild tale!" And Nellie then says, "Well, wait till you hear the next part." because it may disappoint you, it's not as exciting. So she starts in the 1790s now, and Cathy Jr., Cathy II, lives an isolated life at Thrushcross Grange, down in One. And Edgar Linton makes a special effort to prevent her from visiting Wuthering Heights. So she's kind of had this weird sort of reclusive existence, hasn't she? Where she's never really gone anywhere.
Her dad's like, oh, I know what's
best
Holt
for you.
Heathcliff did over there. You are going nowhere near it.
I think that's legitimate.
In fairness, I'm like, yeah, that's basic parenting, I think.
But like her mother, Cathy Jr. is a big, more rambler type. She's always running around looking at kind of...
She's headstrong. She likes, doing what she wants to do when she wants to do it.
She is out on the moor and she meets up with Hareton. She's at the Heights. She kind of ends up there and kind of is introduced to this guy who's her cousin Hareton. And that's kind of a weird bit, isn't it? She's kind of... Suddenly the world seems a lot bigger to her. And
she's like, I cannot be related to you. You are gross.
Yeah. Meanwhile, we hear that Isabella died down south and her son, Linton, returns to Yorkshire. Turns out Linton's a sickly youth.
Yeah, it doesn't Heathcliff call his son a puling chicken?
Yes, he does. Yes.
I don't know what that means, but I love it.
I don't want to be called that, personally, but...
Oh, that's what we call you around the department, so cool. I should stop.
But he's a southern softie as well, isn't he? I like that. Because there's that bit where, like, Linton's kind of like, oh, back in Hampshire, all of my friends were either too proud or too prejudiced or too sensitive or too sensible. But then they all, put aside their differences and fell in love. And he goes, no, that's the wrong way, son, up here. You fall in love first, then you hate him. So that's the kind of big difference, isn't it, between North and South, I think I've learned from this book.
Well, I love the bit where little baby Linton is like, oh, I did not even know I had a father. And Heathcliff's like, what, your mother never told you anything about me? And he calls his now dead wife, Isabella, quote, a wicked slut. And I just want to let you guys know, you might have come across that in Victorian texts. It does not mean the same thing that it means today.
Still not great.
It's still not great, but it basically means somebody who's a bit sloppy, careless, loose, indifferent. Yeah, so it doesn't necessarily have sexual connotations, but it also doesn't not have those connotations.
Time passes again. Heathcliff tells Nellie that he intends for Linton and Cathy to marry, and so, because Linton's obviously going to die soon, Heathcliff surmises, he'll get the title to both Thrushcross Grange and Wuthering Heights. So he's got some kind of weird property wangle in mind via the marriages. I struggle with all this property stuff, all the entails and ownership and stuff.
Yeah, but he's basically worked out some plan, because he was looked down upon in his youth, he's going to use the next generation to sort of right the wrongs and make it so that he ends up the sole owner of both Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange.
Yes, yeah.
I'm just going to mutter.
What was that, sorry? Yeah, exactly. He's got some weird scheme plan. Nellie takes it on board and just kind of is like, I'm not going to tell anyone this.
This guy is so toxic. He is a human 3 Mile Island. I hate him so much.
Yeah. Cathy and Linton have this kind of on-again, off-again clandestine friendship. They kind of write letters to each other, don't they, secretly, and they share books and stuff, and they kind of bond. Meanwhile, we have these comparisons between Hareton and Linton. Hareton's always this kind of rustic, gruff guy. Meanwhile, Linton's this kind of genteel, fey guy, and they're kind of repeatedly being compared, aren't they? And Hareton's embarrassed by it, isn't he? Hareton's really upset.
Well, we have, again, in these sort of two boys, the dynamics of the 3 boys from the older generation.
Yeah,
so,
well, they're like Edgar and Heathcliff in particular, aren't they?
They're like Edgar and Heathcliff, but also they're like Heathcliff and Hindley as well. So there's a lot of like, we're funneling in all the last generation's very complex BS into this little love triangle again. So it's sort of being distilled down and complicated and mirrored back to us in different ways.
Edgar Linton, he gets ill now too. Everybody's ill, aren't they? And Edgar's kind of like, well, maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if Cathy and Linton got together. He kind of sort of washes his hands of keeping Cathy separate from things going on at Wuthering Heights. However much Edgar is well disposed to Cathy and Linton getting married, Heathcliff takes matters into his own hand, doesn't he? So he kidnaps Cathy and Nellie while they're out on the moors and imprisons them at Wuthering Heights and says, you're not going to be able to go home and see your dad on his deathbed until you marry my boy. So,
would citizens arrest this jerk in just a flying tackle?
I don't know. He beat the special gun. I don't think anybody else is capable of taking him on.
So Kathy is forced to marry Linton, even though they like each other perfectly well and her dad's disposed to it. It's just, this is Heathcliff again, just forcing stuff that doesn't even need to be forced at this point. So after Kathy marries Linton, poor old Edgar Linton over at Thrushcross Grange. Yes, nailed it. Did I nail it? Did I?
Just said the Grange.
So Edgar over at the Grange dies. And so Heathcliff now has all of the children more or less sort of imprisoned under his roof. Everything is just, everything's coming up Heathcliff.
He's very similar to Millhouse, isn't he? Yeah.
Yes. But so while the sexton is preparing Edgar Linton's funeral, Heathcliff sort of does a
pops by
just to say hey to the sexton. No ulterior motive. And he pays him to take one side off of Kathy's coffin, the side that's facing away from Edgar, because Heathcliff has decided that when he dies one day, he's going to be buried on the other side of Kathy, and he's going to have their coffins joined up, so they can be in the same grave together. And then, Daniel, he also reveals to Nellie that back in the day when Kathy first died in childbirth, he went and dug up her buried body to fondle it a little bit. And that sort of, again, corpse atrocity, a running theme in this podcast, brought back Kathy's ghost, which Heathcliff could always feel but could never see. She was always just out of reach to him. And so this is one of those famous scenes of necrophilia in any book, that this was the clue in the last episode. And I would say that this makes me want to curl up and die, but I'm worried that would be just playing into Heathcliff's hands. So then, very soon after Heathcliff's son Linton dies, what we're left with is what Lockwood basically saw at the beginning, this incredibly dysfunctional house, possibly even more so than it's ever been, where, we have the newly widowed and orphaned young Kathy Jr., the feral Hareton, and the increasingly mad Heathcliff. And this ends Nellie Dean's story. She's like, great, Lockwood, you're up to date. This is the whole twisted scenario that has led to what you have seen whenever you go over there.
So Lockwood, I think he kind of realises he's probably in too deep. He thought he was going to go up north and kind of live this rustic kind of romantic life. He realises it's a bit more hard going than it.
These are not my people.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. He notices actually that Kathy and Hareton, who is described as handsome or rustic as need be seen, which I don't know if that's a compliment or an insult. He notices that they have a rather antagonistic relationship. So Hareton keeps trying to read. He's kind of thumbing his way through Kathy's books, and Kathy's a bit like,
hands off, you unlettered rustic.
Brute. Yeah, exactly. Unlettered rustic, exactly.
And meanwhile, Lockwood thinks how great it would be if young Kathy, who's not a very nice person, fell in love with him. And he's like, but she's kind of hot and terrifying, which is my exact kink. And he's like, maybe I could marry her. And I'm just thinking, much like Walton in the frame narrative in Frankenstein, Lockwood's not much of a listener.
Yeah, all you've heard.
All you've heard, and you're still there. I'm like, my dude, there are other women in the world.
So, yeah, a year later, he goes back to Yorkshire to desolate a friend's moor. I don't know what that means, but I think we think like some kind of land management, burning it down or something. I don't really know what the moor-based industries are, apart from grouse shooting.
Write in if you're in a moor-based industry. What does it mean to desolate a moor?
Yeah, please do, yeah. So, he comes back up a year later anyway. Lockwood does, and he's like, I might as well pay a trip to my pals, who all really liked me, at Wuthering Heights. So he goes there.
Memory of a goldfish.
Exactly.
This guy.
Yeah. Nellie now lives there, and she tells Lockwood that Heathcliff has only just kind of recently died, and that in the meantime, Hareton and Kathy have become pretty sweet on each other and are planning to marry.
No, I'm sorry. This is like the Flowers in the Attic children. Just because you are going through puberty and shoved in a weird, creepy house together does not mean you guys have to bang.
I think she also says that Heathcliff kept rabbiting on about Catherine's ghost, didn't he, as well? He kind of becomes he becomes unhinged, I think, doesn't he?
Well, there's a bit where he's being really abusive to Kathy Jr. And as he's sort of domestic assaulting her, he stops mid backhand or whatever and says that something in her eyes reminded him of older Kathy, and from that point that's when he becomes a complete recluse and stops eating.
Yeah. Heathcliff gets buried as planned. It's all going according to plan.
What, in his twisted grave with Kathy?
Yeah, in his kind of weird three-berth grave.
In his Super King grave.
Yes, thank you, Super King grave. I've never seen a Super King grave around these parts. Oh, very fancy. That's the people in Gimmerton are saying. They're also saying, the folk from Gimmerton are also saying that they've seen the ghosts of Catherine and Heathcliff kind of moseying around the moor. And he kind of goes and visits the graves, and we have this kind of, I thought it was quite a strangely touching final line where he says, "I lingered round the graves under that benign sky, watched the moths fluttering among the heath and the harebells, listened to the soft wind breathing through the grass, and wondered how anyone could ever imagine unquiet slumbers for the sleepers in that quiet earth." So he thinks everything's all right.
It is very touching. It is also Lockwood who's saying this.
Oh, no, I know, yeah.
And I was left with, oh, you poor simple sod, these two nightmare assholes are going to poison the ether forever, and I am sick to bastard death of them.
No, I think it's going to be all right. I think, well, we'll probably talk about this, won't we? But yeah, sorry. Yeah, the end, for now.
The end.
Question mark.
The end? Well, I think we need to smudge the podcast with sage after that.
So, that was Wuthering Heights. Good stuff, I thought.
I love this book. This book is very disturbing. It's very upsetting. I think it's dynamite. So let's move on to the analysis section. But first, would you like to cast the movie version of this? Because I have a really, genuinely, I believe in this casting choice.
See, I know what you're going to say. And I know that I can't surpass it.
So, because this is a book that is so deeply mean-spirited, you need somebody that can really lean into that. So what I'm thinking is, let's go do a sort of gnarly 1970s version where they really sort of method act. Oliver Reed as Heathcliff, he's sort of swarthy, he would really go for it. Faye Dunaway as Kathy, mean, weird, they would just eat each other alive on screen. I just want a film version where the audience leaves and their chest hurts having watched that. That is what this book evokes in you.
You think of one of those controversial 70s, possibly directed by Ken Russell, one of those kind of 70s films where...
Yes, they batter each other on screen.
Yeah, just unpleasant going on.
But like even the acting style is combative.
Yeah.
Should we do analysis bit stuff?
Yeah. So I was thinking about the term wuthering because I was under the impression that it was a regional dialect term, but you seem to think that it's... Well, that I thought it meant kind of windy, windswept, kind of barren place thing, but you say that it might be a sort of fake Yorkshire term.
They're not really sure because in the version that I have in the introduction, the scholar who I don't want to name because I don't want to throw them under the bus in case this is now proved to be incorrect, but they said that it was an ambiguous term that had no real definition that they could find apart from what Brontë claims is regional. So they think wuthering either was a real word that she is now recording here for the first time, but because it was so regional and so rural that it didn't really get recorded anywhere else, or she just made it up. And according to the introduction that I have, they weren't sure. But regardless, I mean, it connotes certain things, doesn't it? So wuthering, it brings up imagery of wither and weather or weather.
Kind of doesn't really matter, does it? As far as I'm concerned, whether it's a real Yorkshire term or not.
This is all about a lack of good communication, a sort of doubling of patterns. There's all this stuff to do with writing and speech. There was a character that we have never even talked about in our whole summary, and that's
Joseph. I didn't want to talk about it.
I didn't even want to touch it, but basically this whole time they also have this sort of groundskeeper named Joseph.
Old retainer, I thought.
Who speaks in a sort of dialect that is purposefully almost impossible to read. Like the characters don't fully understand what he's saying, and that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
But every time he came up, you and I feel like we're both like, no.
Yeah.
He's not important.
I just kind of skipped over those.
Yeah. Hareton, when he's a little boy, he can't really speak in any sort of understandable way. He can't read. Older Kathy leaves diaries, but her ghost won't speak to Heathcliff. Heathcliff perverts the idea of the storybook hero, so he deliberately misrepresents meaning. When he's courting Isabella. He doesn't hear Kathy's declaration of love. He only hears half of that sentiment. Yeah, this whole book is about bad communication.
That happens a couple of times as well, doesn't it? There's a later bit where Catherine Linton, the young Catherine, kind of misses the latter part of a speech given by Heathcliff. So I think there is this recurrent thing of people ignoring of or interrupting or failing to hear the full details.
And then this is all sort of conjoins with issues of doubling and the blurring of doubles. So, you know, you have two houses with two families. Each family has two children. There are two couples, two narrators, two Cathys, two Lintons, Heathcliffs. But Heathcliff is the sort of interrupting factor.
The joker in the pack.
For most of these, yes. Which I find really interesting. So it's all as a book full of doubles, but then Heathcliff will pop up and sort of mess with it a little bit or make it more complicated or messier than that.
There are doubles, but there's also a sort of sense of trying to square a circle that doesn't fully work. Because Hareton's sort of a Heathcliff clone, but then he's also a Hindley clone. And
yes.
Yeah, so...
Linton is a Heathcliff clone, but also an Edgar Linton clone. Yeah. So it's very messy. This is a very messy plot, but that's the whole point, isn't it? Thinking also about when this was written. So this was written in 1847. And just the idea of how much this is still clinging to or working with romantic literature, even though that has long since passed by. That's, 20 years out of date, thereabouts. Most novels of this period are very urban, or they're dealing with sort of the country versus the city here. And we have none of that. This is so isolated and so rural. This is a very unusual novel for this period. Just really clinging to a past life. And I wonder if that's the point, because they're all sort of clinging to old regrets and wrongs.
Revisiting old traumas.
And old loves and things like that.
Apart from, the presence of Liverpool out there on the fringes where Heathcliff originally came from. It's a kind of it's a primarily rural text. What
do you make of that? Because you did your undergrad in Liverpool. What's the connotation then of? Is it just the fact that it's a big port city and he's come from somewhere?
Yeah, I think. Well, that's what I assume that. We're imagining that Mr. Earnshaw goes to Liverpool to sell wares or whatever, kind of with grain merchants or whatever it is they farm at Wuthering Heights. He just finds this lad.
Is this a Jack and the Beanstalk metaphor of?
Oh yes, there is a bit of that, isn't there?
Kathy, I sold our cow.
Well, there's only 7 plots, aren't there?
These magic Heathcliff.
But by extension, the other thing is, especially considering this is set in the 18th century, Liverpool was a big slave port, wasn't it?
Oh,
so you
interesting.
kind of wonder if there's something going on there about Heathcliff's ethnic ambiguity, and
he sort of loses the racial connotation as he goes on, doesn't he?
It starts off they're all they call him
this dark
Lascar
child
and Gypsy, and but that's kind of goes as he gets older.
But then as he gets older, that completely disappears in a way it's quite intriguing. It's almost like it's especially as he gets rich.
Yes, yeah.
And all of a sudden, everyone just focuses on how hot and rich he is, and they completely drop any of the racialized stuff.
Also, on him being from Liverpool, there are some analyses of it that he's like the sort of commerce kind of entering into this formerly self-contained rural economy and sort of changing it, and all of his weird property machinations. There's this sense that he's taking over and commodifying the land and
new money as opposed to some sort of gentry.
Well, I think it's like
landlordism.
An old kind of quasi-feudal structure is being broken down into a kind of proto-capitalist one.
Oh, that's
There's
interesting.
a kind of historical materialist reading of Heathcliff, which
that makes a lot of sense.
That's the sort of thing I would like, but.
My question for you, which is a much more maybe simplistic question, is this a love story or a hate story or a redemption story? Because I think it's equally read under all three lenses. But if you had to pick one...
I kind of thought it was about redemption. I was a little bit touched, actually, about with young Kathy and Hareton kind of getting together and...
Yeah.
Maybe I'm the Lockwood reading this. I read this with kind of Lockwood hat on, but with him looking at the graves and being like, it's all over now.
Oh, this is where Daniel admits he's a himbo.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. But what you think it's pure hate?
The thing is, I actually really hate these distinctions. I don't.
You asked the question. That's not very fair. You've really thrown me under it, haven't you?
Sorry.
Go on, no, carry on.
Sorry, I was going to say I don't like the distinction. I thought you were going to push back and go, but you simply called.
No, you said you must pick one. So I was like, well, I'm just going to have to bite the bullet.
Oh, you're a rule follower. Okay, right. Sorry, I thought you were really going. You fight me on everything else. I thought you'd fight me on at least the framing of this question.
No, so you think it's impossible to differentiate?
I don't think you can hate somebody this much without loving somebody that much.
Like a country song. Every other category in this story is so blurred. that why shouldn't its overall categorization also be blurred, I think is
That's true. Look, okay, in fairness,
I think you're right.
If I had to pick one, though, if I had to absolutely lean on one, I'd say this is a hate story. He doesn't do that much by way of being redeemable.
Well, I don't think Heathcliff's redeemed. I think it's more just the world, the little world. Kind of, we can see that there's light at the end of the tunnel. I was just going to say, it's a very dog-heavy book, isn't it? There
are loads of dogs in this. Why is that? Do you reckon?
You said that thing at the beginning about Emily.
Just the wildness of it. People can either be loyal or vicious, or maybe both.
Well, yeah, but I think I was just imagining it in a very prosaic way, that it's just that sort of landed world where you need to have dogs. But yeah, also you're right. It's a dog-eat-dog world, but you know when people mishear that and say dog-eat-dog world, it's also a dog-eat-dog world, isn't it? Which is obviously much nicer than a dog-eat-dog world.
Oh, sorry, I was smirking because I knew exactly. I was like, I know where this joke is going, and I approve of it.
Yeah, it's crap. Yeah.
No, I liked it.
Okay, great. So I believe you have some advice relating to reading books.
So I do have some advice, and I think this book has shown us that you cannot really make assumptions about any literature of a specific time period. If I said Victorian novel, many of you would tune out, and yet listen to this plot, right? It's sexy, it's violent, it's weird. I guess the important thing to remember is that in all time periods, there were probably just as many different sort of styles of writing and authorship as there are today. So if someone in the future said, oh, well, I don't like books between 2000 and 2100, that would sound ridiculous if you think of the scope of literature today. So, give books from any time period, even if you've read 2, 3, 5, 10 of them, give it another go. Try to read really widely, because, there are different forms of authorship out there. So just don't make assumptions.
Part of me wants to be sarcastic when you say this and be like, you think a book from the 1840s is going to be boring, and it's far more boring than you could have even imagined. So, don't be prejudiced. It could be more boring. But you are right, especially just like the 1840s by itself. The amount of
the transition of what literature
the number of people working back then, and like the variety between them there. I think even within the Brontës, that joke about Charlotte and Emily, that cartoon strip of them kind of dude watching, and they like these kind of horrible men, and Anne is like, no, he's clearly dysfunctional.
Yes.
Even the Brontës are quite various, aren't they?
So. Yeah. So just, try not to let Hollywood's perception of what these types of novels are and what this time period can offer you. Don't let that influence your reading list too much. Give it always one more chance.
Yes.
Sorry, did you have any advice?
I just think if there's a sort of like slightly proggy 70s pop song about a book, probably a good sign.
Do we have a clue to the next episode?
Kind of Welsh, I'd say.
Kind of Welsh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, it's not Welsh, but it's kind of Welsh.
That's not helpful.
Well, I think, because last time you said the clue was too obvious. So
it was.
Yeah,
all right.
A bit more.
My clue to the next episode is that it is sort of set over the Christmas holiday period. There's a lot of unexpected violence and sexual temptation at Christmas. There's also a major movie coming out about it soon.
Perfect Christmas material, isn't it? Time for the summer.
It is not A Christmas Carol.
No. Yeah, there's no violence and sexual temptation in that, is there?
There is if you look for it.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
All right. Email us at savemefrommyshelf.com or tweet us at smfms_podcast. And tell us the classic lit that you thought you would hate and ended up loving, because I really thought I was going to hate this book when I had to read it in my undergrad, and it ended up being the best book I've ever read in my entire damn life.
Or the reverse, if you thought you were going to love it and turned out otherwise.
Ooh, good one. Yeah. Just tweet us anything, really. Do we have a better sign-off this week?
I don't think you need one. I think just cut there. Thanks for listening to Save Me From My Shelf. Our music is The Overture to Don Giovanni by Mozart, and cover art is by Catherine Wu. Our thanks to Aston University's Centre for Critical Inquiry into Society and Culture for funding the startup of this podcast. Contact us at savemefrommyshelf@gmail.com or at smfms_podcast on Twitter. And do not, I'm going to remind you, do not forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Do not forget. Thank you.